Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, best-selling author, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Those of you on the YouTube channel can see that I have placed myself here in just a sea of roses. It is the beginning of May in California, and the roses are getting crazy. Things are getting insane out in the garden. And that seemed absolutely perfect because what we are looking at today is Curtis Sittenfeld's unbelievably great romantic comedy. I always begin these lectures with the question of why we are discussing this book, why I think that this book is worth your time and mine. And the answer to that question in this case goes back to Jane Austen week. So we were discussing rewrites of Pride and Prejudice, and I mentioned Eligible by Curtis Sittenfeld, and I think I had like this very fond, like, oh my gosh, right, Curtis Sittenfeld, I love her work. At the beginning of the pandemic, I read Rodham when it came out, and I was so impressed. And I had really loved Eligible when it came out. I don't think I had read anything before that, but I was just thoroughly, thoroughly impressed by her. And so when I was thinking about Jane Austen week, I kept coming across romantic comedy in all of these different bookstores, and I thought, well, this is perfect. I also was coming off of some very heavy-duty reading. I think I was reading like Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo, and I had just read Anita Bruckner's Hotel du Lac, which is actually kind of, well, it's like an anti-romantic comedy, but those are both much more kind of a little heavier, much more literary fiction type of stuff. And so I was really excited about this idea of diving into a Curtis Sittenfeld book, which they're just always so solid and so well constructed and so interesting and intriguing and well done, and the prose is excellent. The fact that they're very inventive, they often are building on a really interesting premise. Certainly in Rodham, this idea of Hillary Clinton as not having married Bill and as not having sort of played second fiddle to him was super interesting. And of course, in Eligible, the idea of setting a Pride and Prejudice actually in my hometown here. Mr. Darcy happens to be from my hometown in California. I mean, her version of Mr. Darcy. But so there's always an interesting premise. And in this book, we absolutely had that, which was so satisfying. But I also knew that it would be a bit of an escape. For those of you who like an agenda, we are going to discuss a very, very brief biography of Curtis Sittenfeld. We're going to talk about the cover and title. We'll talk about the opening paragraph, as we always do. We'll touch very briefly on the narrative voice. And then we're going to talk a bit about the meta quality, the idea of romantic comedy, the title of the book, as being very descriptive of what this thing actually is, which is, in fact, a romantic comedy. We're going to talk about also, though, the idea of comedy, and the sense that she is writing about a comedy show. For anyone who hasn't actually cracked the book, it's important to know that this is the book is essentially looking at the life of a woman who is a writer on a show called The Night Owls, TNO, which is very closely aligned with SNL. And in fact, Curtis Sittenfeld did an enormous amount of research and read, everything she could about Saturday Night Live and interviewed two cast members and just really, really dug in. And I loved that part of it. So there are lots of references here to, I'll call it a nighttime sketch show or SNL or TNO. They also, Curtis Sittenfeld had this great answer to one of the questions of the interviewer, which is, what did she change? What was different about her depiction of TNO versus, what she had learned about SNL? And her answer was so cool. She said that generally speaking, when these writers are writing sketches, they don't give them sort of inventive, cutesy titles. And one of them was my favorite part of the book, was this idea of a sketch called Nancy Drew and the Disappearing Access to Abortion. So I loved that. And again, it was one of these times where I was like, wow, Curtis Sittenfeld is really delivering on the idea of writing someone who is a comedy writer. But I also really appreciated the fact that if it were an actual skit on on Saturday Night Live, they would not have given it that very clever title, which I did in fact love. So it's important to note that this whole premise is this idea of the show as being built upon a writer of a show that's very much like Saturday Night Live. We're going to talk about the structure of the novel, which is excellent. We're going to talk about the excellent dialogue in the book, some aspects of the prose that are really, really solid. We're going to talk about a few of the plot lines and how masterfully she builds tension. And then we are going to talk about the incredibly deft use of humor, which I think was a very tall order in this book, and she absolutely delivered. Okay, in terms of biography, Elizabeth Curtis Sittenfeld was born in 1975 in Ohio. She was one of 4 children. There were 3 girls and 1 brother. And she went to prep school, I think in Massachusetts. I am assuming that that was the basis of prep. And she went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is such a huge deal. As someone who attended 3/4 of an MFA program at Bennington, I can tell you that the Iowa Writers Workshop is truly, truly, I mean, it's a measure in and of itself, meaning if you are admitted to that program, you are an excellent writer. She lives, I believe, in Minnesota now. I have listened to a couple of interviews, and there was something about her house in Minnesota where I think she was, at least during the pandemic, but I know that she lives in the American Midwest, which that comes straight from the bio in the jacket copy. For some reason, the idea of the American Midwest really appealed to me. It's not just the Midwest, it's the American Midwest. She is married and has 2 children. Wikipedia says that they are 2 girls. Now that we have raced through our biography of Curtis Sittenfeld, I want to talk about the cover of the book, the title, and the opening. So the cover of the book, I actually have the UK cover. I know I keep talking about these books that I purchased when I was in London. I've been there recently because my husband has some work there. So I have all of these UK covers, which is it's very cool actually to compare them. I really like the US cover. So during one of the interviews, someone was asking how she felt about the fact that, the cover of the book looks a bit like a Valentine. And, she, as a serious writer, has written something called romantic comedy. And did that sort of make her uncomfortable? She said that thing that writers say, which is they have very little control over their covers, but she thought it was fine. And she actually said that she thought it was very pretty. I like it because not only, we have the pink and the red, that's a color scheme I love. You all know that I love pink, but I also like the way in which the sort of geometric pattern to me looked like those kind of arc lights or Klieg lights, maybe they're called. That might not be correct. But it sort of looked like those kinds of spotlights that you have on actors or, in Hollywood, that kind of thing. Only subtly, but a little bit. And I liked the little pencil marks and things that sort of spoke to her as an editor. The cover of the UK one really didn't seem to have anything to do with anything. And in fact, I think it really kind of like demeaned the whole idea. I mean, I don't know. We hear her at one point, she's driving across the Midwest. We hear about her trip in like somebody's Buick, like just a really thoroughly unglamorous drive across the country during COVID. It certainly didn't conjure, a picture like this. So again, I felt like the UK version did a bit of a disservice. And I really did like, in fact, the American cover. I love the title. I like the idea of being so bold. I mean, anytime someone calls like their novel romantic comedy, you know that they're going to be kind of messing a little bit with it. To me, it seemed like it was such an obvious like naming of what it was that I was looking forward to seeing sort of how she was going to manipulate. And in fact, I was not disappointed. I also liked when you parse the title a little bit and you have this idea of romantic and comedy, there is a lot of romance in the book, but there's also like a lot of like anti-romance. The whole premise of these nighttime shows like Saturday Night Live, I mean, there's a lot of absurdity, there's a lot of sort of grossness, and in fact, our narrator writes a lot about, pooping and farting and, BO and all of this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that is sort of running in contrary to the idea of the romantic. And in fact, in one of these interviews, Curtis Sittenfeld was talking about how when she was writing, from the narrator's standpoint and had to act as if she were a writer on one of these shows, what she did was she often thought about how life is it's absurd, it's embarrassing, and that she went through her life for a period of time, and anytime one of those sort of embarrassing, absurd moments would happen that seemed like, oh, this could be an SNL skit, she in fact treated it like that. So I like this idea of the thoroughly kind of unromantic aspects that are really developed beautifully in the novel. And I like that part, the sort of romantic part. And then the comedy part is really great because a lot of the book is in fact about comedy. I mean, it's not just about romantic comedy. It's like really about comedy. And this idea of stand-up and this idea of humor and this idea of these sketch comedy shows and what makes things funny and how you structure a joke. A lot of the behind the scenes stuff about comedy was in fact very, very helpful. I also think, if we go back to the sort of ancient classical definition of a comedy, it is something that ends in marriage. So I had this idea, with this book that is literally called Romantic Comedy, that she's either going to, treat us in the end to a marriage, or she's going to treat us in the end to something that is very much not a marriage. So setting up this idea of like, yes, I'm going to deliver, something either very much like a rom-com or something very much not like a rom-com. I really enjoyed that. I like the idea of being so straightforward about, the structure and sort of all of the different tropes that are going to arrive and all of the different sort of premises upon which romantic comedy is built. In one of these interviews, because the interviewer asked her, how she felt about writing something that might be considered chick lit, Curtis Sittenfeld said this very interesting thing about how chick lit is essentially being rebranded as rom-com, and also that women's fiction is now being sort of rebranded as book club fiction. And I did some thinking about that. I mean, as a 54-year-old woman who did in fact publish a book in 2008, a lifetime ago, the fact is the vast majority of readers, it's not the vast majority, but the majority of readers are women, between the ages of like 30 and 70 or something. And I'm more and more really feeling like gender is a construct, which is something that Curtis Sittenfeld talked about in the interview. And it's also, a theme that runs through the entire text of romantic comedy. Gender, yes, it's a construct, but also I do think, there are ways in which, women's fiction, and let's face it, like most book clubs are women. I mean, I know a lot of book clubs, and actually one of them is all men, but, that's out of like a dozen. So, I mean, I do think that there is a certain acknowledgement, and Curtis Sittenfeld did, in fact, say in the interview that, romantic comedy fiction in these rom-com books, in fact, are selling well. And you can see why. I mean, you can absolutely understand. There's something very satisfying about working either within or against these kinds of tropes. I myself very excited to read a romantic comedy. On that note, Curtis Sittenfeld in the interview, I'm going to end up quoting the interview a lot because it was great and it was really interesting to me what she had to say. One of the sort of origin stories of romantic comedy is that she published Rodham in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was sort of silent, and she had no sense of kind of like how that was going. She didn't get to do any book events for it, didn't have a lot of feedback about that book, and so and also of course during COVID, was feeling like what we all needed and what she needed was something short and something kind of fun. And she began a book that was in fact not short and not fun. So she put that aside, although she said she might return to it. And then they were watching a lot of Saturday Night Live, she and her children and her husband. And at first, she's like, I have this great idea for this screenplay, and then it, in fact, ended up being romantic comedy, which I'm so happy. And this book it's not super short, and it's not super light. And for me, what really saved it is a romantic comedy, but there's also a huge amount in here about the makings of a show like Saturday Night Live, which was awesome. And then, there's a lot about COVID, and then there's also just this really beautiful handling of the idea of finding true love. And sort of all of that cheeseball stuff, cheesemonger stuff. If you've read the book, you know that, she writes a great sketch called The Cheesemonger. So we have this sense of really digging into a genre here in a way that was very, very satisfying for me. So I love the title. Okay, we're going to dive into the first part of the book, the opening pages. You should not, I've read many times, reach for your phone first thing in the morning. The news, social media, and emails all disrupt the natural stages of waking and create stress, which is how I'll preface the fact that when I reached for my phone first thing one morning and learned that Danny Horst and Annabelle Lilly were dating, I was furious. I wasn't furious because I was in love with Danny Horst, or, for that matter, with Annabelle Lilly. Nor was I furious because 2 more people in the world had found romantic bliss while I remained mostly single. And I wasn't furious that I hadn't heard the news directly from Danny, even though we shared an office. The reason I was furious was that Annabelle Lilly was a gorgeous, talented, world-famous movie star, and Danny was a schlub. So I love this opening. It's telling us so much. We're not going to parse the language because in lots of ways, I think the real gift of Curtis Sittenfeld's language is that it's fairly straightforward. But you see from the very beginning, we have this first person narrator. She's so relatable. I mean, it really seems like she's either, like your own voice inside your head or like your very best friend. And she's saying things that are so relatable right from the start. And in fact, she continues to be incredibly relatable, which allows us as readers to really invest in her. This idea of knowing that you shouldn't grab your phone first thing, I mean, everyone knows that. It also is so deft because it's really situating us in this moment and giving us a huge amount of information. We know, in fact, that she has not found romantic bliss. We know, in fact, that right at the beginning, there's this very important premise, this idea of the Danny Horst rule, which is, in fact, that, these kind of schlubby men, meaning like, not that attractive, end up with women who are much, much more attractive than they are. One thing that was important to me is that the Annabelle Lilies, or, that sort of analog, is this idea of women who are not just much, much more attractive, but in fact women who are very talented and women who are very smart and accomplished. So that was important. It's not just sort of like some vapid, starlet. It is in fact someone who is very, very accomplished, and that's part of what bothers our Sally. We're going to take a slightly deeper look at this narrative voice. Again, I really loved how accessible and how relatable this voice was, but it's also really, really important that it is first person. So one question to ask if you're planning on writing a novel in the first person, or if you're reading one, it's also interesting, is to ask why this person and why now. So, the question of why this person, this is the perfect person to narrate this, and it's the perfect person to talk about this phenomenon where, schlubby men are marrying women who are much more physically attractive, which of course is turned on its head during the course of this book. So it's very good that we have a first person narrator, but we also have this idea of that first person narrator as being in a very privileged space. So one of the things that the interviewer asked Curtis Sittenfeld was to address this kind of pattern that has come up in her fiction where she has these small groups of people. So in Rodham, it's the White House. In Prep, it's the prep school. Here, it is this kind of family of comedy writers writing this nighttime sketch show. And practically speaking, as a writer, it's always good to have a somewhat limited cast, certainly. And there's also kind of a writing adage that it's a very good idea to get a group of people in a confined space, one that is kind of stressful and interesting, and then to put more pressure on them. So the idea of moving through 1 week of Saturday Night Live is a perfect example of a group of people under an enormous amount of stress. Curtis Sittenfeld also said this very interesting thing, which is that oftentimes in these groups of people, you'll have people interact, two certain individuals will end up interacting in a way that's totally realistic, but that might not happen kind of out in the real world. And she was talking specifically about, these sort of rarefied communities. Obviously, the White House is totally rarefied. In this case, all of these writers are very funny. They're very bright. They've worked very hard at their craft. And then you're putting them together in a situation where people who, yes, they've both kind of risen to this certain stature. In the case of Noah, he's this, incredibly popular songwriter, and Sally is a writer on, a very popular show. So you have these people who are very different, but both have entered this kind of milieu, and you have really interesting interactions, potentially between very different people, where it seems slightly unrealistic, but is in fact made realistic by the context. It's really very smart. On the part of Curtis Sittenfeld. So it's perfect that we have this first person narrator because we really do want to be privy to what is happening in Sally's mind, things about Noah and things about, observations that she's making. But it's also just this very privileged look at what it's like to be a part of a show like Saturday Night Live. I loved that part of the book. And it would not have been as good in the third person. There also was a whole part in the middle of the book where we have emails that are exchanged back and forth between Noah and Sally. And I have to say, if you've listened to the Fox page for a while, you know that I'm not a huge fan of the epistolary novel. So epistolary simply means, letters that are written back and forth. In this case, they are emails. It's a very limited kind of genre because obviously you only have, the first person talking. And it's even further limited by the idea that the first person who is talking, you have two people, two first person narrators, essentially, and they're only talking to one other person. So whatever they're saying is very tailored to that one other person. So it can be very, very limiting. And I did not find their email exchange limiting, but I did find myself missing this narrative voice. I found myself missing some of the kind of fleshing out and the connective tissue, which that is a couple of really gross metaphors right there in a row. But I found myself not exactly rushing through the emails, but like a tiny bit. And again, really missing our narrative voice because in fact, it was one that was so compelling. I felt like it was like a good friend. The last thing I will say about Sally as a narrator too is that not only is this first person narrator, you're privy to all of her inside thoughts, but Sally herself is someone who's very smart. She's someone who's very self-aware. She's someone who is really able to articulate her feelings really well. She's a writer. She's also really funny. So in many cases, the idea of this first person narrator works exceptionally well here because in fact, Sally is a writer and she's funny and she's likable and she's self-aware. So it is in some ways sort of an ideal first person narration. So obviously with a novel entitled romantic comedy, you're going to have a lot of mentions of romantic comedy. Well, not necessarily mentions of, but you're going to have a lot of these sort of tropes. So in my copy, we're going to look at page 140. So this is a perfect example of our first person narrator being, forthcoming and revealing and being self-aware. But we also have, this sort of, seeds of the romantic comedy being planted here. Noah's first musical act was being introduced by his sister Vicky, and it was ambiguous, the song I'd watched him rehearse. Ambiguous is perfect. It's so genius on the part of Curtis Sittenfeld because, she's very ambiguous about how she's feeling. And in fact, at this point, Noah's feelings also seem rather ambiguous. It's so well done. This time around, it made me unexpectedly sad and then made me think maybe I should end things with Jean and try, after all this time, for a real boyfriend. Not anyone from TNO, certainly, and not Noah Brewster, because he was Noah Brewster, but someone whose eyes I'd want to gaze into and who'd want to gaze into mine while we lay on a huge bed with a million pillows. So this is funny. It's so deft because, in fact, she's very sincere about this idea of like, oh, maybe I should have a boyfriend. Sally, she had her starter marriage when she was in her early 20s, which we get a very nice description of that later in the novel, what went wrong. And in fact, we're intrigued. I was intrigued by Sally's parents. I was intrigued by, we know that they're both dead. So I was sort of like, ooh, how did that happen? And in fact, both of those sort of micro stories, they were very quick, but I found them very satisfying, which is really, a testament to how well Curtis Sittenfeld does this sort of thing. But it's also important to know that she's invested in this idea. She would like this, but then, this kind of, this kind of cheesiness, this idea of like, I would really like, an actual boyfriend into whose eyes I could gaze. But then you also have this kind of deflating of it and this kind of comedy, this comic relief at the end about the idea of a huge bed with a million pillows. So Sally at this point is sort of just beginning to make us aware of these ideas of like, oh, maybe I actually do want true love. She's very well established at her work. She has this very successful career. She's competent. She is happy doing her job. At one point, she talks about how TNO is the love of her life. But in fact, we know that she also would like romantic love. One of the things I really enjoyed about the book in terms of like thinking about this as a romantic comedy is that, there are these tropes, and I was interested to see how Curtis Sittenfeld was going to work against them. So one of the things that you do in a romantic comedy is, you have the chemistry between the people, and then you put various obstacles in their way. And one of the questions the interviewer asked was like how difficult it was to sort of not have the traditional obstacles. And it is true that in many ways, there aren't kind of the sort of cheeseball, kind of trumped up, weird, kind of overly constructed obstacles. But what I liked about this, in fact, was that most of the obstacles, and Curtis Sittenfeld speaks to this, were kind of Sally's self-sabotage. And the reason why that didn't seem, sort of weak and yucky to me was that, of course you would have doubts about, like, if you are a woman who is, yes, accomplished and bright and funny, but, maybe not like smoking hot, if when faced with like a potential romance with someone who is smoking hot and who's super famous and accomplished and kind and all of those things, you would have a lot of doubt. So I loved the idea that this kind of self-sabotage on the part of Sally constituted the main obstacles. The other thing that I really liked about that was kind of the flip side of that. Sally is entertaining a lot of doubts, and she's kind of doing these mind games, and she keeps kind of sabotaging the relationship and throwing, these bombs into the whole thing and blowing everything up. But on the other hand, we have Noah, who in fact is like very evolved, and he's done lots of therapy, and he's sober. And, Curtis Sittenfeld, our narrator, tells us these various things that have happened in his childhood or in his youth that in fact shaped him in many ways. But so there were these times where I was so impressed by Noah Brewster as having been, through a lot of therapy and being very self-aware. And I like the way that turned the romantic comedy trope upside down a little bit. We have a woman who's doubtful and sort of, keeps kind of sabotaging the whole thing. And we have this very forthcoming and very vulnerable and very honest man who's actually done tons of therapy. So we have this even, fairly early in the book on 154. Noah Brewster says this: "I've never been in a relationship I thought could last forever." And then a little further down, "I guess if I start talking about attachment theory right now, I'll sound like I've been in a little too much therapy." So then a little further down, she says, "If it sounds like I haven't been in enough therapy, it's because I've chosen Midwestern repression instead." He laughed, which I thought that was funny. I thought that was very clever. So we have them starting to talk about attachment theory, which is, they talk about it a little bit here too, which is simply that you recreate the patterns, from your family of origin. So yes, you could say this is a little heavy-handed here, the fact that he is bringing up attachment theory, but it totally worked for me, mostly because she's very upfront about it. He's someone who's done a lot of therapy. He's someone who's gotten sober. He's thought a lot about his parents. And you would, in fact, if you're involved in certain types of therapy, you would potentially learn about attachment theory. And it's beautiful that right at, sort of early-ish in the book, page 150 of a 367-page book, we're having this idea of him as being very evolved and very sort of in touch with his feelings and able to articulate them well. So this was one of those tropes that I liked the way that she had turned this upside down. Another way in which this kind of, the romantic comedy trope is turned upside down is this idea that often we feel like Noah is in fact pursuing Sally, and Sally is often putting him off. And I liked the articulation of this right after they had this whole discussion about attachment theory. So on the very next page, or 2 pages later, on page 156, she says, "I think of TNO as the love of my life. Unaccountably, my eyes filled with tears. And then I realized it wasn't because I thought what I was saying was sad. It was because it was true and not sad at all." So it's very important to me in this romantic comedy that she, in fact, is very happy with her life. She's very satisfied with her life. There's very little stuff in here about any kind of maternal urges or thinking about children, which I loved. It just doesn't seem like a part of what is important to her. So down at the bottom, she articulates this even further. She talks about how, if you're looking for a suburban life and going to bed at, 10, that's great for you. But what she says is this: "But there are lots of other ways to put a life together." She's very satisfied with her work. She tried marriage, didn't work for her, but she's not overly angsty about that. It's just a very important articulation at the beginning that Sally is not someone who's like needs to be fulfilled by some sort of, soulmate who's going to complete her. She is in fact a very complete person, which is very important because that does push against this idea of the romantic comedy. So before we do on 293, we're going to talk a little bit about romantic comedy. But there was this part where she says, by the way, I have an IUD. So this was so funny to me as someone who married someone that she met during the last week of college and, did not ever really date anyone. I mean, I had boyfriends, but I like never went on dates, and it certainly didn't like experience life the way that in fact Sally is experiencing it, the dating life. She says she has an IUD, and then a little further down, she says, and I also have a clean bill of health sexually. And he says, good to know, and same for me. And I was like, oh, okay, good, because they were not having protected sex. And I was a little bit like, oh, okay, what's happening here? The sex writing is very good. It's very hard to write about sex. And she does the perfect thing, which is simply describe what is happening. She also lots of times just elides the sex. There's that thing where they like start making out and then the next paragraph begins afterwards, blah, 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 which I actually fully respect. I think that is great. So then we're going to move on, past this kind of logistical thing, which I'm always interested in. I'm interested in how writers talk about condoms and how they talk about sex and what they choose to include or not in terms of like the reality of dating these days. Okay, and at the bottom of 293, if life were a romantic comedy, I'd have awakened the next morning from a deep, restorative, and gracefully positioned slumber, with sunlight streaming in through the windows and Noah standing by the bed holding a mug of coffee for me. So then instead, she wakes up and it's like 2:00 in the morning. It's the first night they've spent together. And there's a lot of anticipation about how she's going to poop. And she's discussed this with her friends, from the show. And there's all this different stuff. A lot of her humor on the show is very scatological. So, and I loved that. Again, this is one of those sort of embarrassing things that Curtis Sittenfeld feels like would make a perfect SNL skit. So she finds a guest room and, she's able to poop and all of this stuff in the middle of the night, which, good for her. And then Curtis Sittenfeld has this genius thing where 3 pages later, so they've had sex, it's great. Noah falls asleep in the bed. She wakes up in the guest bed. And then we have this. When I awakened, sunlight was streaming in through the windows and Noah was standing by the bed holding a mug of coffee for me. I love this so much because literally the line before reads, if life were a romantic comedy, I'd have awakened the next morning with sunlight streaming in through the windows and Noah standing by the bed holding a mug of coffee for me. It's so funny to me and so genius that literally two pages later, we have exactly that. Sunlight was streaming in through the windows and Noah was standing by the bed holding a mug of coffee for me. So it's so good because there are these subtle times when we do have this sort of these tropes of the romantic comedy, sort of popping up in the book in ways that she's really playing with our expectations. And in some ways, this is feeling very much like a romantic comedy, and we're going to have our happily ever after, and they're going to get married. But there's also this kind of attention paid to it, even from the very beginning, from this excellent title. And the 9 mentions of the word romantic comedy. There's a lot of attention paid to the fact that we are, she's working within the constraints and choosing to use some of those tropes and not use others. It's amazing. So now that we have talked about sort of the ways in which this rom-com structure is used, the way that the way that Sittenfeld is both working within and also against the kind of strictures of the romantic comedy, I want to dip a little further into the structure of this book. So we begin with a prologue. And then we have 3 chapters. And then I was so happy when there was an epilogue. I literally circled when it said epilogue. And I was like, oh, good. That's what my marginalia says. Because I knew I was getting toward the end of the book because I was holding a paper book. And for some reason, I thought it ended at the end of the 3rd chapter. So I was so happy. I also like the idea of really satisfying the reader by giving an epilogue. She's going to tie these things up in a bit of a bow. And it's very satisfying. And, again, this is a romantic comedy. She's really giving us what it is that we want. So the idea of the epilogue, jumping a little ahead in time and sort of tying things up was very satisfying. So I also really liked the structure because we have this whole first chapter, which is really, to me, it's sort of the heart of the book. It's really kind of the bulk of the book. I think it's what I will remember most, insofar as I will remember anything about the book, even like tomorrow. But we have this very long first part that is 1 week of the taping of the show, and I loved it. I often would sort of, as I do, skip over the like chapter and section headings. But what she did, of course, is she had the date and the time. And it was so satisfying to like move through this kind of antic week in a way that we were sort of, everything was time stamped. So you got a sense of the urgency and how well structured things are and how intricate all of this stuff is. Curtis Sittenfeld said that when she was interviewing, after she'd read all of the memoirs of like Colin Jost and Tina Fey and Amy Poehler and, had done all of this research on Saturday Night Live, the kinds of questions that she was asking the writers who had been there recently was like, where would a writer stand when the show is being taped? And like, these very sort of logistical questions, because in fact, she needed to make the world seem very real. And in fact, that was one of the huge bonuses of this first chapter, which is, it's a lengthy chapter. It felt so real and it felt so convincing and it was so consistent and so, she just did an incredible job of making it feel really realistic in many ways. It didn't read like a memoir, but like you feel like the research has really been done and you can imagine all of these things happening. Partially that's because the dialogue is so, so good. And because the choice of detail is so strong, but it's really, really excellent. So you have that first chapter. We have a second chapter, which is their emails. And I really loved that jump. I have to say, the first part is 2018, and I did not know that we were going to jump in the second chapter to 2020. And when we did, again, my marginalia was like, oh God, COVID. So it was very satisfying. I did not know that this book was going to be about COVID. And it is now beginning of May, 2024. In some ways, I feel like we're not talking enough about the experience of COVID. In other ways, I'm very happy to have it kind of, at least like submerged in the collective consciousness. But I really welcomed this idea of sort of looking back at how different people experienced that period of pandemic and lockdown. And in fact, this is another way in which, like, the idea of having people in small spaces and putting pressure on them. I mean, it's really very deft the way that we're going from the very sort of, hermetically sealed world of TNO, which is SNL, in that first chapter, to like an even smaller and even more compressed environment, which is, Sally and Jerry and Sugar, the beagle, and then, this kind of passionate and really revealing and interesting email exchange between the two of them. Then, of course, things get even tighter when she goes to California and it's essentially just Noah and Sally together. So the use of COVID here and the use of the pandemic and lockdown is excellent. It's really, really good. So that is part of the structure of the book. And again, I was so happy in chapter 3 when our narrator returned. So I just thought the structure is just very, very well done. So on page 250, she's so good at the ending of chapters. And I really loved this. At the end of 250, it's the close of the second chapter. And we have, in their email exchange, we have this one line from Noah. I realize this also might disrupt the space-time continuum, but can I just call you right now? I read that and look, I have like a little heart in my marginalia and an asterisk. I loved that. It was so kind of surprising and so immediate and so amazing. It really showed me that I was very invested. There was also another point where the Lorne Michaels character, I can't remember what his name is in the book, but he gives a compliment to Sally. It's at the top of a page. I can totally picture it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I know I'm really invested in this character, because when he's like, big night for you, Sally, or like, well done, Sally, or like whatever the compliment is, it was all, like, I was just like, oh, our Sally, I'm so proud of you, Sally. So I had this sense of like really being invested because in fact I was so happy about that compliment from, I mean, again, this may have to do with my weird thing about male authority figures. And the Lorne Michaels character is obviously totally that. But, it's how often do you get to like have that kind of wish fulfillment in a novel? I loved it. I was just like right there with Sally, just drinking in the compliment. Okay. The other thing that the structure does, which is really interesting, is it allows for all of these different subplots. There is a lot happening in this book. I mean, we have, these different sections that are very different textures and very different time frames, and very different things are happening in each one of these. But we also have a bunch of subplots that are really interesting. We have this question of Danny and Annabelle. We don't know if they're going to stay together. And that gets, it's a very interesting subplot in lots of ways because it's, of course, it's an example of the Danny Horst rule, but it also is very telling in terms of how a show like this would function. We have all of the questions of Vivian, I think is her name, and the eye doctor. So the best friend and the eye doctor. We have this question of Sally's parents. I was very curious about them. Obviously, we have this gigantic question about, whether Sally and Noah are going to get together. And I was also very invested in the idea of Jeremy. And I always say Jerry. Jerry is the name of the stepfather. The idea of Jerry, he has COVID, and there is a big question as to whether or not he is going to survive, which I thought was really well done. One quick note on that. I really cooked up this whole plot line for myself that involved Viv and the fact that she was pregnant, and she is the friend who is Black. And so there was a comment very early on about infant mortality and mothers, maternal mortality being much higher in Black women, even across class lines. So I heard that and I was like, oh gosh, something's going to happen to Viv. And I know that Viv is actually concerned about how her it's during COVID. So like how her COVID experience is going to be of delivering a baby during the pandemic. And I kept thinking, oh my God, we're going to have some terrible thing happen with Viv and her baby in this third section. And that's going to be what's going to bring Noah and Sally even further together. So I actually was so relieved. Every time there was like any kind of thing, like at one point, Sally, writes a text to Viv, and the line is something like, I didn't hear back from Viv right away. And I was like, oh, here's it. I was like, oh, here it is. Like, this is when it's gonna happen. Things are gonna really go badly for Viv, and it's gonna be awful. I can tell how much I love a book by when I wake up in the morning, first thing I think of coffee. And then after I'm thinking of coffee and how delicious my coffee is going to taste, I remember which book it is I'm reading. And my first thought this morning was like, oh God, I hope Viv makes it. I was like, I got to go read that book. I got to finish it up because I really need to know whether or not Viv is going to survive her, pregnancy and delivery of a baby during the pandemic. So I was happy that, in fact, that was not an issue. It's a little bit of a red herring. So I think you could perhaps feel a tiny bit manipulated by the fact that there is some sort of question, but I was just satisfied. I liked every part about it. And then I was relieved. I just was very happy that both of the births of the babies in the book seemed to go off without a hitch. Spoiler alert. We're going to talk about the ways in which the prose is absolutely incredible, a few of its strengths, some of the really salient ones, and a couple of examples. Then we're going to talk about humor, and then I'm going to leave it at that. So some of the aspects of the prose that are very strong across all of Curtis Sittenfeld's work is this idea of relatability. There's a term called verisimilitude, which is this idea of creating a very realistic world for your reader, and she is so good at that. And not only does she create a really realistic world, but her heroines are people who we feel like we know so well, and they are so consistent. There were a few times where I was slightly confused by why Sally was freaking out. And I mean, I knew it was because Noah Brewster is super hot and whatnot. But I was like, wait, I'm not really understanding why she's freaking out now. And then there would be ample, context that would arrive, or there would be an explanation. So there were times when I was a little bit like, wait, this seems like she's freaking out for no reason. But in fact, there generally was a reason. But I was very invested, and I felt very much like I could relate to her as a character. The dialogue in this book is unbelievable. So I want to look at two different instances of the dialogue. Curtis Sittenfeld has such a good ear. And part of the reason why this dialogue works so well is because it's really revealing of the characters. So anytime you're writing something, you want the dialogue to be doing lots of different things, but mostly you want it to be revealing the characters. For all you writers out there, you do not want to be delivering exposition. There was one part in this book where one of the characters was like, oh, you didn't like the way that I was dressed when I was delivering when I was presenting at the Golden Globes last night or something like that. I think it's Annabelle who's saying the line. And I was like, ooh, that was something she would not have said in real life. That was definitely like in order to let us know about the Golden Globes. But there was one example of exposition, of sort of background information being delivered in dialogue in a book that otherwise, it was like the exception proving the rule. There was this one part that I noticed when in fact the dialogue is amazing. So in order to really check out how amazing the dialogue was, I was like, I'm going to do my little parlor trick where I'm just going to open to any section of dialogue, which obviously you can tell when something's in dialogue because it's all, parsed out into paragraphs. And it was so satisfying. So I just, the first one I turned to was on page 73. And it's an exchange between Viv and Sally and Henrietta. Viv is talking about the eye doctor's phone number, maybe? I think phone number. He gave it to me in case I had follow-up questions about my eye. Right. Henrietta made air quotes. About your eye. No offense, Sally, but that email's boring and not at all funny, Viv said. Granted, but it's open-ended and doesn't hit the medical stuff too hard. I purposefully didn't include the word I, but it does have the words feeling good, interested, and date to subliminally lure him in. Seriously? Viv said. No. I said, well, maybe. I think it gives you both the cover you need at this point. Are you asking him out or expressing appreciation for treatment? Who can say? And you seem modest for not assuming he knows you're on TNO, right? Even though I bet he does. Viv wrinkled her nose. So there's several different things here. The gloss is excellent. When we don't have a lot of attribution, so it's not like I said this, Viv said that, which makes it a little confusing when I'm reading it out loud to you. But the idea of right, Henrietta made air quotes. It's just a straightforward, description of what is happening, and it's really deftly and excellent. The way that she does this very economically. So there's also a sense of the three of them speaking in voices that are really genuine, but are also revealing a lot, not only about what's happening in terms of plot, but just in terms of how they are together, this notion of them all crafting this email together, or a text message, and the idea of them being funny. And again, this is sort of like a mini little rom-com that is happening within the larger scope of this book, which is all about romantic comedy. So it's really, it's a beautiful use of dialogue. Throughout the entire book, it's telling and it's witty and it's interesting, and I just really think the dialogue is excellent. There are a couple of different parts where tension in the novel comes up, and it's subtle, but it's excellent. So if we look at page 101, this is an example of when the reader is really feeling very aligned with Sally, in part because she's sharing some of her confusion and ambiguity at this point. So this is Sally talking about Noah. Noah grinning, Noah using my name, Noah's ability to be warm and normal while my insides churned. It was all somewhat devastating. Did he remember that, the previous afternoon, he'd serenaded me? Was I supposed to never mention that he'd serenaded me? Had he not serenaded me? So these are these kinds of questions. I mean, I literally have down here, question the two of them. I mean, marginalia is often so dumb, but like this question of like, are they going to get together? And is she misinterpreting things? And like, we're pretty sure he was serenading her, but then like, is he serenading her? And so there's this excellent thing as the reader where you're like, Curtis Sittenfeld knows, but we are really in the dark with Sally because, time has not unfolded yet. We don't know how the romantic comedy is going to conclude, but there are lots of examples of this kind of subtle tension. And again, the idea of this first person narrator as really delivering these things very well. She does such a good job using all five senses. So this is another real strength of the prose. Anytime you can get smell, and obviously, there's plenty of visual stuff in any novel, which is actually a miracle when you think about it. But if you can get the scent of something onto the page, it's really, it's a real coup. And she does so throughout. On page 128, she's actually with Danny. We think that he and Annabelle have broken up. After I'd perched on the edge of the love seat, he was taking up so much of it that my right thigh was squeezed against his left hip. I could smell him. But it was a scent that was recognizable and human and not disgusting. The recognition of it felt familial. So I liked this. I have a question about whether or not it might be a little bit vague, but I actually liked that. I liked the idea of maybe it was laundry detergent, maybe it was like, He's the one though who's always burping, and she can always smell his burps, which is so gross. And I appreciate the fact that Sally Mills is very like upfront about that, and that's like it's like one of the hallmarks of the kind of humor that she's interested in. But I did actually feel like maybe they dwelled a bit too much. At this point though, it's this very sort of familial thing, and it's very nice to underscore the way that they really do have kind of a sibling relationship. Later, she talks about the smell of Noah and how he smells like the woods and bread. And I just thought that was so well done. And she says it a couple of times and in different contexts and with slightly different nuance in a way that is just really, really excellent. I was also very impressed by one aspect of her prose, which simply has to do with description. So there's this kind of tricky thing right now where writers are, when they want to talk about any sort of skin color, people get themselves a little tied in knots to not sort of, name something that seems like it's maybe racially insensitive or that you're like trying too hard to have diversity or whatever. Recently there was a book that was talking about how one woman's like skin color, her skin color was like the same color as the tea she was drinking or something, and like these kind of belabored ways of saying that someone is not white. And I thought that Sittenfeld did such a good job. It's something I've been paying attention to recently because it feels very now. It's very difficult, to sort of navigate these waters, and she does a beautiful job with it. On page 132, this is when Sally walks in and she sees Noah with his kind of entourage. Behind him, standing or sitting on the surprisingly crappy furniture in the surprisingly unfancy space, were Autumn, Madison, and Addison, one white man with a well-tended goatee, one black man with a well-tended goatee, a spiky-haired woman in overalls, a blonde-haired woman who looked like a suburban mom, and a white guy in a suit and tie. So what's beautiful about this is, she's giving all of these different sort of salient things that are describing each person. I mean, the white woman who looks like a suburban mom. I mean, that's giving us a lot of information. Things like a spiky-haired woman in overalls. We're picking different details for each of them that I think work really well, because then you can naturally say, one white man with a well-tended goatee, one black man with a well-tended goatee. And in fact, here we have the added bonus of her repeating this idea of these men with the well-tended goatees. And so it feels very sort of natural to talk about skin color. And I think at one point she talks about Viv as being black in a very matter-of-fact way, but it works because, and also about Henrietta as being gay and married to a woman. She just talks about her wife. So there are ways that she is signaling, that someone is a person of color, and not in some sort of belabored way, but simply in stating it in a way that fits well into the context of giving lots of different details about lots of different people's appearances. It's really, I think, very well done. The last thing I want to talk about is the use of humor in the book. So I had the delightful experience while reading this of constantly picturing Hannah Einbinder. She's the young comedian on Hacks. And there's something about the tone of her in Hacks that really kind of melded with the idea of our narrator here, Sally. So it was so delightful because I was hearing Hannah Einbinder's voice and I was seeing Hannah Einbinder's face. And she seems to me like the right level of sort of attractiveness. So it was such a treat because I had like sort of this very cinematic thing happening in my mind where I was mostly the voice. It was interesting. I was really hearing Hannah Einbinder sort of narrating the whole thing. I find her so funny, and it seemed perfect because, of course, she is also a comedy writer. I happen to be watching Hacks, which is a show I love. So it was really this beautiful thing, and it really made a lot of the humor work because, in fact, Hannah Einbinder is someone who has this very dry, very witty, very intelligent type of humor. So I was so impressed. I mean, again, I think Curtis Sittenfeld really like tasked herself with something very difficult, which is to like be a very funny writer. And there were so many instances of very clever humor. There were also some excellent instances of Sally realizing, in fact, that she was leaning on humor like a crutch and that she needed to like say something real and not do the normal sort of barbed, banter that she normally would have done with her colleagues. that's when she's with Noah and has to be more sort of emotionally available. But the book itself is very, very funny. And in the interview that I heard, Curtis Sittenfeld talked about the different ways that she thought about humor. And it was nice because the interviewer was complimenting her essentially on being very funny. And she was very humble about that. But she talked about this one time when during the lockdown, she was in the car with her children, and they did this kind of festive brainstorming thing where they were talking about the skit on ONL where or on TNO. I just really mixed those together there. On TNO, where they're talking about dogs doing a Google search. So when there was a description of these sketches, that one to me did not sound that funny. But then when she actually gave the search terms, I thought it was so funny. So we're going to close. I'm not going to read the end of the book because I don't want to spoil this for anyone. But I do want to take a look at that because it's a good example of the ways in which the humor is so well done. And Sittenfeld really deserves credit for being a very, very funny, subtle, wry, intelligent humor writer. So it is on page 38. At this point, it is Viv and Henrietta and Sally, who are all working together to come up with the search terms for this sketch where the dogs are Googling things. With her mouth full of beef kebab, Viv said, "Am I adopted?" Which, I mean, I'm not going to explain all of these to you, but that is so funny. Like, lots of dogs are adopted, but there's that question, like, for people, because obviously the thing here is, like, if you're searching for Google terms, these are things that they're burning questions for dogs, but there are also things that are funny for humans. I'm not going to explain all of these. You'll get it. I'm going to start over, though, because it's so good. With her mouth full of beef kebab, Viv said, "Am I adopted?" With my mouth full of spanakopita, I said, "Am I a good girl?" With her mouth full of falafel, Henrietta said, "Am I 5 or 35?" I'm so tempted to explain all of these to you, but I am sure that you're getting it. I also, though, want to pause and say this idea of the three of them each having their mouth full of something is so, I like it. It's kind of like the sense of like a callback in humor. It's really, and there is a lot of attention here about how to structure jokes. There's really a very deft handling of humor throughout in kind of a meta way, but also some excellent examples. So then they go on with these questions that I found so funny. "Why is thunder scary?" I said. "Discreet crotch-sniffing techniques," Henrietta said. "Cheap mani-pedis in my area," Viv said. "Oh, and cheapest self-driving car." "Best hamburgers near me," I said. "What is halitosis?" Henrietta said. "Halitosis, what to do?" I said. "Where do humans pee?" Viv said. "Taco Bell Chihuahua, male or female?" I said. "Target Bull Terrier married," Viv said. "Lassie plastic surgery," Henrietta said. "Funny cat videos," I said. "Corgis embarrassing themselves on YouTube," Viv said. "YouTube little dog scares away big dog," I said. "Dog hub, 2 poodles and 1 corgi," Henrietta said. "Waxing my tail," I said. "Is my tail a normal size?" Viv said. "Refinancing my mortgage," Henrietta said. So I love this part. To be clear, also Curtis Sittenfeld said that she added those R-rated ones after she and her children had done their brainstorming in the car. But I was very much with our narrator Sally at the end of this, where it gets kind of they're talking about porn, dog hub or whatever that was. They start talking about porn and waxing their tail, and things are getting very sexual in a hilarious way. And then the last question being, how do I refinance my mortgage? It's so well done. It's like, it's funny enough, and all of these are funny in their own way. It's like a whole world is built into each one of these jokes. And then to have the last one be so prosaic and so unexpected, just as everything is escalating, it is just genius. It's so well done. It seems very appropriate to leave our discussion of romantic comedy on that note because, in fact, I really enjoyed the comedy of the book. I also enjoyed all of the romantic parts. So I hope that today has, helped you appreciate the ways in which this book, which was supposed to be short and fun, this wasn't actually that title, but, that's what she set out to do during the pandemic. It is escapist and it's delightful, but it also is so incredibly well done and so rich, and the prose is is excellent and the plotting is well done. I found it satisfying on every level. So I hope that today has helped you appreciate the ways in which Curtis Sittenfeld's writing is just excellent across the board, but romantic comedy is really just an absolute delight to dig into. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.